Good morning, Revolution, everyone. Welcome to the show this Friday the 13th. I want to send warm Friday the 13th greetings to all of our communist witches out there. Also, it's kind of an appropriate topic, I think, for this Friday the 13th, a little bit spooky. We've got today Marx, social death, and class radicalization. First, I would really love to welcome Joanza and Ellen. This is your first times on the show. And of course, greetings to Eric. It's always nice to see you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, comrade.
So this morning's topic is this concept called social death, which is sort of a pretty basic Marxist theory. But for our audience, I wanted to go ahead and start off the show by reading at length a quote. And usually that's a little bit obnoxious, but hopefully this will give context to the rest of our discussion today. The quote is from Frederick Engels's Conditions of the Working Class in England. And in it, he sort of comes up with this really interesting concept of something called social murder. So I'm going to read it right now. When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians, that means workers, in such a position that they inevitably meet too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them, through the strong arm of the law, to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of the single individual, disguised malicious murder, murder against which none can defend himself. And basically says that, let's see, that it knows the consequences of its deeds, meaning capitalism or the system or the society that is producing this kind of premature death, that it knows the consequences of its deeds, that its act is therefore not mere manslaughter but murder, is basically the point, right? So that the conditions that are setting up in society to basically cause thousands and thousands, but I guess today millions and millions of people to suffer a premature death, that this is what's called social murder or social death. And so I guess there's been a lot of social death in the news in the last couple weeks, wouldn't you say, panelists? So Eric, just to start off, there was a statement on the CPUSA website regarding what happened, I think it was last week, with this assassination of a health insurance CEO, Brian Thompson. Would you like to sort of sum that up for the audience?
Sure. Thank you, Taryn. It's good to be here. So the CEO of United Healthcare was assassinated by an individual, and one of the things that happened following that was a great upsurge of anger and almost hero worship for the person who did the assassination, the killer. The killer had a manifesto in which they said that they were really sick of the healthcare system in the United States, which put people before profits, and that this was their way of lashing out at that. Unfortunately, it was a very individualistic way that did not really help anybody. So
Mm-hmm.
the um, the the question before us is really, how do we counter the inhumanity of the current healthcare system? And I would like to suggest that the more effective way, and certainly the more humane way, but the more effective way as well, is to build a mass movement that actually affects social change and that ends the hegemony of the HMOs and these huge monopolizing health insurance companies that don't care at all about humanity, don't care about the people that are paying them, and don't care about the amount of death that they are causing. Thanks.
Right. Yeah. No, because it seems to me like just considering how many people are suffering under the current health insurance regime, um, that if that sort of individualist approach worked, that people would probably be doing it all the time. But there were even some people online who were saying, "Oh, I think it was Aetna who had said they were going to start putting a time limit on how long you could be under anesthesia, that they would stop covering you after a certain amount of time." And then following this assassination, they actually retracted that new policy change. But that's the kind of thing that's going to come back in like 6 weeks or 6 months when everybody is sort of moved on in the news cycle. So I don't know. I don't think that there is really a sustainable change here. But the reaction to it, Jawanza, was really quite interesting. This anger that Eric is pointing out seemed to be sort of out of nowhere. Like, I think people were looking at stuff on LinkedIn, for instance, and they were like, "Oh, what's going on with?" They were saying some pretty crazy stuff on LinkedIn even. What do you think that kind of like outrage is about? Do you think it's about the internet and people just feel more lax, like saying things like that on the internet, or do you think that maybe this is an issue that touches just that many people?
Well, I think it was a really interesting phenomena. So first of all, I just want to say it's an absolute pleasure to be in this space. I always take full advantage and take very seriously an opportunity to speak to the masses about our experiences as working class people who are interested in, transforming the world so that we're able to advance life. So I just want to say that. So thank you so much for having me. But I think that all of the internet fervor around this assassination, uh, I think, is reminding me that there is a crisis of imagination and understanding about what we need to do to be able to mount a genuine offense against the ruling class in the United States. And I think that that means building mass social movements, as we heard from Eric. And that means building the kind of organizing infrastructure. So I think that at moments like this, whenever there's so many people engaging in a conversation that is, by its very nature, a critical political question about who has access to healthcare and who doesn't, and why, we, those of us who have the privilege of understanding how and the opportunity to organize and the ability to do so, we have to seize these moments and create political homes for people that are beyond, of course, the duopoly and beyond simply voting for representatives to change the world. So I think it's a good sign that there's an appetite for revolutionary movement. But I don't think that we should feed the imagination that somehow this kind of violence is the path forward for us, from my perspective.
No, I think we would all agree with you on that point, Joanza, for sure. Ellen, United Healthcare, which isn't a healthcare company, it's a health insurance company, they actually posted record profits last year. The number that I got right before the show was $23 billion. What is it about capitalism that kind of feeds into this premature death? It's not just about health insurance. We can see in the news also the fact that people are no longer able to get life-saving health care like abortions. People aren't able to get trans health care. There are all these different bans that are getting spread throughout the country, and this kind of encouragement by, I think, the ruling class to scapegoat a lot of these populations. What about capitalism in specific sort of condemns people to this premature death?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to also repeat what Joanza said, that really it's an honor to be able to be here and speak with everybody today. I think I'm thinking about, this question of premature death and capitalism. I think that's in some ways like the natural result of turning like basic needs such as healthcare and other basic needs into a commodity that is, sold for a profit by these large companies in the billionaire class. I'm also reminded, of like whenever we have these moments of very sort of spectacular violence, like the killing of this health insurance company CEO, not healthcare, it captures so much attention. Whereas the sort of banal everyday violence that affects working people is very rarely remarked upon. Certainly doesn't make headlines, doesn't, create this sort of this sort of panic, which we've also seen in the media, at the same time as a lot of people have been reacting and having almost like a hero worship relationship to the killer. There's also been discourse sort of reacting in panic that so many people could be desensitized to that kind of violence. But we can consider how like people are desensitized to sort of more slow and subtle forms of violence every day. And there I'm reminded, also of a concept that comes to us from an environmental scholar named Rob Nixon, very similar. It's the concept of, he calls it slow violence, which, reflects, for example, the way that things like pollution in the environment sort of accumulate over time and cause harm to the body. So those are, the conditions that the working class is facing constantly, as a result of corporate greed, really.
Yeah, 100%. That slow violence is really key. I mean, I saw this post cover this week, which really drove me out of my mind because on one side of the post cover, you had a photo of the assassin, and people were saying, "Oh, what an evil bad guy this dude is." And then right next to it was a photo of a grinning and celebratory Daniel Penny, basically going out for drinks after he was acquitted of, I guess it was second manslaughter and also negligent homicide. And I think about that kind of slow death that you're talking about, Ellen. Jawanza, would you like to sort of expand on that with regards to the Jordan Neely case? Because that really just was a gut punch when I saw that. I know that you and I worked together on trying to raise awareness about homelessness, and I know that the YCL in New York was active in trying to secure an indictment in the first place. But the fact that I read earlier that this guy is going to be the invited guest of Donald Trump and JD Vance at the Army Navy game. How does this kind of dovetail in with the previous conversation that we're having about health insurance companies and profits?
Yeah, honestly, what we're experiencing right now is a series of catastrophes of unimaginable proportion. I think that Daniel Penny, being presented in this way and being uplifted as a sort of hero by the right wing is not surprising, as we've seen them behave in this way before in their most recent period. Thinking about Kyle Rittenhouse, I think his name is, etc., and other figures like that. I think the principal thing for me, as someone who is committed to ending homelessness, and therefore I must be committed to dismantling capitalism and building a revolutionary socialist future, because that's the only future I can see in the 21st century and beyond where we're going to end homelessness. I think that what happened to Jordan Neely is a perfect example of the concept that Ellen was describing, because so much of the attention, the knee-jerk response of people, especially in this last period, related to vigilante violence or white supremacist vigilante violence and police violence against Black people, against poor people, against people experiencing homelessness, is this knee-jerk reaction to call upon the systems that are actually the propagators of violence against us to mete out justice for us, which I think is a huge fundamental mistake. And simultaneously, I think that Daniel Penny and actors like him must be held accountable, but we cannot expect the carceral system that is erected and maintained and expanded in the interest of the capitalist class. We can't expect to get genuine justice from there in the first place. So we should be trying to undo the conditions and the systems and the ideas that led to Daniel Penny being free and even encouraged to strangle um, Jordan Neely to death on a subway train in front of people. I think we need to challenge the rhetoric, for instance, around who is safe, who is unsafe, who's worthy of love, care, and protection. And I think
Right.
that what we saw this week was the state again reminding us that you can be summarily executed in public if you are a part of the class, the of people that have been deemed worthless.
Right. it's that premature social death that we've been talking about, and Eric, I was talking to Jawanza earlier this week when we were doing a story for People's World, and I thought that one thing that he mentioned that I hadn't really, it wasn't in my mind at the time, but as we're talking about, the carceral state and the carceral system not being able to do justice, the rhetoric of the politicians too. The rhetoric of the politicians around drumming up this kind of racist scaremongering against homeless people, about people who are experiencing mental health crises. How does that kind of rhetoric, the state saying these people are worthy of premature death, how does that sort of feed into the capitalist drives for profits?
The capitalists have to undermine any acknowledgement of the dignity of working people, just as they had to undermine the acknowledgement of the humanity of slaves in that period of our history. So, just as slaves were just two-thirds of a person in the slave owner's mind, not in their mind, but in the slave owner's mind, so we have the state violence against immigrants, which is saying that immigrants are not real people. We have rising mortality in state and federal prisons because people who are incarcerated are not viewed by the billionaire class as humans. We have the attack on polio vaccination that is coming out
Mm-hmm.
of RFK Jr. and the Trump administration. That is another form of social murder, social death. We have the social murder by fiat of children in Gaza, Sudan, Congo, and other areas that the United States pays for to advance its imperialist aims. We have the higher maternal mortality rates in states where there are more abortion restrictions. We have South Carolina moving to impose the death penalty on women who have abortions. Um, we have all of this hate-filled attack, literally attack on the persons of working people. And to justify that, we have a ideological attack on the idea that working people are in fact human, that if you are not a billionaire, are you even worthy of having a voice in this society? Are you even worthy of being seen as a human being? Thanks.
No, I mean, it really does cheapen life. Like, I hear what you're saying, Eric, and I think that that's a really important point to make, because it says that certain people's lives are cheaper than other people's lives, and you can kind of see that with the whole health insurance claims process in some ways, right? But then you can also see it in this increasingly hateful rhetoric and these attacks against our class. And I think it's interesting because one thing that sort of rhetoric and this sort of violence does is it really serves to split the class up. Like, we don't have unity around issues that are actually like important to everyone. And I was going to ask Ellen, actually, because you do a lot of work around the environment. it, talk about premature death, talk about social murder. I mean, there are whole communities, mainly communities of color, that are being poisoned by this. But something like global warming is definitely going to affect everybody in the working class. How do you see us being able to bring this idea of social death or social murder into this conversation around the environment?
That's a really great question, and I think that it's actually really central to when we're talking about specifically about environmental justice, right? Which there we have wrapped up in that concept the idea that yes, on the one hand, the issues of climate change and environmental and ecological destruction more broadly do affect like the human population as a whole. However, and will continue, um, to exert an ever greater effect as conditions worsen, which they likely will. But at the same time, that those effects are felt right now very unevenly, both within within a nation like the United States, where the difference has a lot to do with both class and race. As you were talking about, you have predominantly poor communities of color. Like one example of this could be the so-called Cancer Alley in Louisiana, which is sort of an area of Louisiana with a primarily Black population, in which industry factories have caused heightened, due to the sort of pollution that they cause in those neighborhoods, have caused heightened levels of pollution. Heightened levels of cancer in those populations of the communities that live next to them. And it's not, of course, by accident. The factories are placed there near working class communities of color for a reason, right? To create those conditions, and also to afford other wealthier residents the privilege of living like without those conditions that are so harmful to our health. So when we really center this idea of social death and of slow violence in the conversation on the environment, it becomes, I think, very clear that we need a strong lens of justice when we're talking about environmental issues, right? And I think it's also clear that in order to really address these environmental problems, there's not just a way that we can and this is what sort of capitalism proposes to us, that we can somehow consume our way out of the environmental crisis, by making different consumer choices. But that won't address these root issues which have to do with the production side of things, with these explicit policies that affect the health of working class people. So we need that much broader and more far-reaching vision of how do we actually how do we actually dismantle these sets of conditions that are affecting people's health and well-being on such a deep level.
Yeah, I mean, you're really pointing to sort of like the systemic nature of this whole thing, which I think is really key. One of the things that I thought was rather frustrating about this assassin is that it almost plays into a media narrative, where it's one person, where it's just this one individual and they can make a story around this individual, and then once that story is over, the issue just sort of disappears again. There's this other part of the quote I want to share: disguised malicious murder, murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission, but murder it remains. And I think about that because no man sees the murderer, no person sees the murderer. When we're talking about how we can fight back against social murder and this sort of premature death that comes under capitalism, isn't part of that, Jawanza, to expose, not the man behind the curtain, because of course there's no one murderer. If there was one murderer, then, we could put that person, we could take care of it, right? But it's this system. How do you think we can try and expose this as part of the fight back?
Yeah. Well, before I go there, Taryn, I wanted to just, point back to some of the things that Ellen was talking about. Just to name that I'm actually originally born and raised in Beaumont, Texas, which is not far from the Cancer Alley that Ellen was describing. So I'm used to seeing the infrastructures of environmental degradation, and they're just normal to me. And so once I was able to be removed from that environment, I was better able to see what was actually happening. But I think to your question about how do we expose this sort of slow death, or the invisible behind so many premature deaths throughout society. I think one, again, it's about organization. We need to have people that have, like most people, working class people need to be a part of some meaningful, I would say, leftist organization where we're working together to develop our own critical lenses by which to understand the world. It's very important that when we're implying an analysis or when we're trying to understand a problem, that we are aware of how we are interpreting said problem. What lenses are we using? Our identity, our race, our class, our gender, our sexual orientation, our geographical region that we come from, our religious practices or lack thereof. Each of those are lenses by which we can see and experience the world. And that's oftentimes how we're understanding things. So I think that the conscientious working class revolutionary thing to do is for us to adopt new lenses, and those are the lenses of our people, of working class people. And I think that it's always incredibly dangerous to try to come to the summation of an issue and the solution individually. We must
Mhm.
absolutely come to that understanding collectively, and I think it has to be intentionally in organization where principled struggle can take place. And then from there, once we have a sense of understanding, we can make action.
Yeah, that's a great point. Eric, we're talking about this sort of collective approach, and you kind of started off the conversation a little bit talking about mass movements. So, how do you see us building a mass movement against social murder? Because we've covered a lot of different issues on the show today. We've covered, health insurance, we've covered the environment, we've covered, racist murders and homelessness and things like that. How can we kind of bring all of that together into one mass movement against social murder? Or are we instead sort of bringing something into those movements that we're struggling alongside? If you could give us some of your wisdom, Eric.
I don't know if I have wisdom, but I do have ears, and I'm listening to what Juanza and Ellen are saying, and both of them are actually pointing the way forward. The issue is not necessarily to build one movement, because there's, as Juanza was saying, there's lots of lenses through which people see their lives and through which they understand what they're dealing with. So I think rather than trying to move everybody into one movement, it's how do we join the existing movements? How do we engage with everybody where they are and um, try to make those lenses reality based, to center them in the actual objective reality of human experience today, which is demanding change if the species is going to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And that is quite simply the thing that unites everybody. It's an all people's struggle. And so if we can meet people where they are and bring that struggle into all the other struggles, then we can be successful in challenging what's going on and challenging this social death and this social murder. But one of the other things is that it's got to be reality based. It can't be drifting off the way that the MAGA folks are into just talking about whatever comes to their minds and thinking that it's okay. Um, it's got to be a real struggle to that actually addresses the real impacts of the social murder that people are experiencing every day in this country under capitalism.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, Ellen and Jawanza, just one more question to the both of you. Do you feel as though, because some people were saying that, oh, this is a very academic sounding concept, social murder or social death. And then, I start off the show reading this quote of this guy who loves to write in run-on sentences, and it's in language that's a little bit older. But do you feel as though this framework is something useful that we can bring into the struggle, this idea of social murder, social death, premature premature death? Is this something that's useful in talking and organizing with other people? What do you think, Joanza?
Well, first of all, I just want to say what Eric had to say. Absolutely. I do think that though we're in a high and good spirit, because we have to be to some degree optimistic people to believe in the working class and our ability to transform the world and to ultimately save ourselves, because Eric is exactly right. We are facing an existential crisis. And honestly, if we're going to survive, we have to win. And so I think that this concept is incredibly helpful. I think that it complicates the reality, because reality is complicated. In fact, I think that this desire for 1 minute, 2 minute explanations of all the things, all the history of the world and all of the nuances of our lives is a byproduct of capitalist consumerism. I think that yes, we want to ensure that people are able to access ideas, um, And also, we want to make sure that we expand people's ability to articulate and to be able to describe and to locate themselves and their experiences in a continuum of time, in a continuum of struggle. And that takes study. It takes uh, organizing. So I think we have to be in community where these things can be explored with other people over time. And I think that the only way forward is if we expand the complexity of how we're thinking about what's happening to us. It's not as simple as this one person attacked me. This is about a hundreds years old system that is playing out exactly as it was meant to, and it is leading to the absolute threat against us as human beings, all organized life on the planet, and also all non-human life. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much, Taryn.
No, that's a great answer. Ellen, what do you think? Is this framework helpful for organizing?
Yes, first of all, yeah, full agreement there with everything you just said, Joanza. I think, and I think you mentioned something about the idea of like a communal understanding, and I think that's part of why the concept of social death is so powerful and resonant. Because first of all, I think it just gives a name to something that people do feel and experience, right? You, as working people, like you have this sense that yeah, everything is like against you. That there are these sort of insurmountable obstacles that you're facing, and that there really is no way out as an individual, no individual solution that can lift you out of those conditions. So I think the concept also really points to yeah, the structural nature of the issues that face us as the working class, and therefore point also to structural solutions that involve working with others, coming to a collective understanding, not only of the issue but of how to approach and tackle it, and actually like build something better, and build society that actually will secure like the conditions of life, as you were saying, Joanza, not only for humans but for all different forms of life. Yeah, I think that I also agree that we should not shy away from deepening and making more complex our understanding of these issues, because again, I think it will just lead to having a better collective approach, that doesn't isolate people. I think when it comes to like the topic of the environment, the sort of messages that we receive about it are very isolating, right? That it's all about your sort of individual choices, how you as an individual are affecting the crisis. If we think about an idea like the carbon footprint, that really isolate us, and are quite demotivating, because it's actually really impossible to meet the sort of imagined standard for how an individual can act to make a positive impact. But when we have a collective understanding, and we know that we need a structural approach, I think that can actually be much more motivating and hopeful, as we continue to struggle on these issues.
That's so right. I mean, this is not an attack on us as individuals, right? This is an attack on us as a class. And there is no individual solution to what is a class attack, an attack against our class. Like, there is no way that each human individual, and this is something that is so ingrained in us through education, through all of the media that we consume. We're taught even to think about voting like it's something that you do as an individual. I take my vote down to the vote store, and I buy a politician with my one vote, and hopefully I'm throwing him with other people. No, it doesn't work like that. Like, these are collective issues. It impacts all of us individually, and depending on who we are as individuals, it will impact us more or less. But it is something that is an attack against our class, which is why we need class-oriented solutions. And so I really appreciate all of you so much. This was such a rich discussion today, and I hope that we can have you on the show again. But until next week, so thank you so much again for joining us. And until next week, stay strong, stay safe, and stay in the fight. Have a good weekend.